If Putin wins in Ukraine, will he continue to wage war against other European countries? Unfortunately, experts believe the likely answer is yes. Let's break it down. 2024 will be an uncertain year for the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, and there are plenty of reasons why. Market volatility, inflation, high oil prices, and economic stagnation have all been tied to the unpredictability and interconnectedness of global military flashpoints. For this reason, the escalation and potential convergence of large-scale wars remains a chief concern. According to a global risk survey conducted recently by Oxford Economics, many business experts predict the Russo-Ukraine war, the Israel-Hamas conflict, and the China-Taiwan relationship will pose significant risks to the global economy over the next 2 years. Pessimistically, the International Monetary Fund has predicted slower growth into 2025, with Ronald Temple, chief marketing strategist at Lazard, a global financial company, remarking that the global trajectory is toward more frequent conflicts of increasing consequence. Paramount in all this is the potential for waning political support in the West for Ukraine, resulting in diminished material assistance, an outcome with real bearing on the extent to which Ukraine can achieve both its short- and long-term military objectives. 2024 is an election year for the United States, Ukraine's top supplier of military equipment and aid. Since the beginning of the conflict, the US has donated more than $111 billion to Ukraine, spearheading a global coalition which has seen more than 50 other nations offer an additional $37 billion. However, recently Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin labeled Ukraine's fight for freedom one of the great causes of our time. There are fears that the outcome of next year's pivotal elections may exacerbate the geopolitical relationships upon which, by and large, Kyiv's fate hangs. Real concerns over the projected trajectory of US foreign relations if a new president, or an old one, is elected are pronounced as well. In this light, Zelensky's recent visit to the United States, his third of the war thus far, was all about maintaining friendly ties and testing the political waters as the nation braces for a potential political changing of the guard. With the next US aid bill to Ukraine tied up in the Senate and internal political maneuvering in the European Union producing similar outcomes across the Atlantic, there are worries about defeatism as Western democracies venting about the costs and fatigue of war imperil Ukraine's ability to defend itself from further Russian aggression. This has put institutions like NATO on high alert, prompting Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of the North Atlantic Alliance, to recently reaffirm the organization's view that there remains a real risk that Russian President Vladimir Putin will not stop with Ukraine if he achieves military victory there. There has been a common enough refrain throughout the war. Arguably, it has been the glue which has unified the transatlantic community behind Ukraine, the common thread that has bound them in their desire to continue offering the type of support that has, thus far, propelled Ukraine toward the military heights it has achieved, recapturing over half of the territory originally seized by Russia in the initial weeks of the invasion. Our support is not charity, Stoltenberg added. It is an investment in our security. The only way to reach a just and lasting solution is to convince President Putin that they will not win on the battlefield. And the only way to ensure that President Putin realizes that he is not winning on the battlefield is to continue to support Ukraine. The political turbulence set to descend on the United States has made Washington, as one commentator recently put it, the most important theater in Russia's war in Ukraine. Today, we want to dive deeper into Stoltenberg's claim whether continued military support truly constitutes a strong investment for Western societies. How exactly is Russia's military being weakened? And does continued material assistance provide enough of a symbolic and physical deterrent value to merit the tens of billions of dollars thus far poured into it? The mechanics and implications of the Western Ukrainian security investment. Before we dive into these questions, it's important to understand what is currently on the table in terms of material assistance to Ukraine and the mechanics of how paying for and delivering that equipment actually works. In mid-December, US President Joe Biden announced another round of military aid to Ukraine, in a package worth around $200 million. This type of aid package was extremely common in the first 2 years of the war. Lately, however, they have been announced with less regularity. There's a pretty good reason for that. In a November 4, 2023 letter to Congress, White House Budget Director Shalanda Young appealed for more congressional assistance, claiming the Biden administration was out of money to support Ukraine in this fight. This seemed a bit contradictory, if only because in the ensuing weeks the Biden administration did an about-face and announced 3 more aid packages totaling $475 million. Is the assistance pot empty, or is there more to be milked from the system? The answer is complicated. Ukrainian military assistance tends to fall into 2 categories: long-term weapons contracts that have to be filled, produced, and then shipped overseas. And for anyone who doesn't know, these contracts are overseen by an American organization known as the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, or USAI. And there is the immediate transshipments of weapons, aid, and material from existing American stockpile, a process overseen by an organization known as the Presidential Drawdown Authority, or PDA. According to the most recent reports, the USAI's congressionally mandated money is all but spent for the foreseeable future. Recently, however, the PDA, the one who pulls from existing stocks, was notified by the Pentagon that it had overstated the value of weapons it had already sent Ukraine, overcharging the Ukraine's weapons account by $6.2 billion. For Ukraine, this was like being told there was a huge mail-in rebate for the equipment they'd purchased, and now they had $4.4 billion of in-store credit to spend. Long story short, that is where these multi-million-dollar packages are currently coming from. The broader problem is that while the money may exist to order US equipment, the American Department of Defense is less optimistic than ever that it can actually fill said order. The Pentagon's shelves are looking more bare by the day, and there is no long-term plan in place to restock many categories of weapons, artillery, and ammunition on the scale Ukraine needs them in the near future. That's because Congress has to approve any bill authorizing new budgets to fill these orders, and in case you were wondering, the current congressional budgetary threshold for buying the weapons Ukraine needs is down to about $1 billion. That's why Ukraine isn't the only one fretting over the holdup of the latest security assistance bill in Congress. The United States military itself has been stressing that they won't be able to buy all the weapons they need to ensure it is ready to defend the American homeland. If they authorize Ukraine's pending $4.4 billion equipment order, US policymakers and military officials will essentially have to decide if they are okay delivering the goods, even if they can replace only a quarter of that amount for their own use. Domestic financial constraints and the downturn of American military preparedness are the principal reasons cited among those who wish to end the provision of military assistance to Ukraine. The current congressional defense package is worth $110 billion, with just over half of it, a cool $61.4 billion, earmarked to support Ukraine. The rest is split between the global and domestic needs of the United States military, provisions of about $14 billion in aid to Israel, the same amount left over for US efforts to try and secure its southern border. So far, things aren't looking too good for its passage. Conflicting priorities complicate prospects for compromise, as Zelensky himself put it in a speech at the National Defense University in Washington. If there's anyone inspired by unresolved issues on Capitol Hill, it's just Putin and his sick clique. There is an interconnectedness between foreign support and domestic economic outlooks that deserves a mention here. The more the United States gives Ukraine, the more it has to replenish its own stocks, which means injecting tens of billions of dollars into local defense industries, factories, and commercial producers of drones, ammunition, and other equipment. These contracts benefit communities across more than 35 states. Again, the problem is balance. Balance between Ukraine's immediate and long-term military needs and the United States' own. It's hard to put the sheer amount of US-provided aid to Ukraine since 2022 into adequate context. It dwarfs the aid given to any other nation over the past few decades by an order of magnitude. Yet tellingly, it's also dwarfed by the amount the Pentagon budgets for its own needs each year. A budget comparable only to how much the US Treasury was authorized to bail out Wall Street banks, automobile companies, and other sectors during the US financial crisis. Depending on one's perspective, both of these causes were worthwhile investments, one inward-facing, the other outward-facing. But the prospect of continued assistance itself may not even be an issue if Congress can't approve additional help. Negotiations are set to stretch into 2024. Europe is grappling with similar issues. Currently, Hungary is circling the wagons around its decision to hold up a similarly scaled €50 billion $55 billion package designed to stabilize Ukraine's war-hit finances over the next 3 years. Part of the reason Ukraine has found its counteroffensive mired in such subpar conditions over the latter half of last year was because it took so long for the West to reverse its policy of dribbling in necessary material aid in insignificant quantities. Fortunately, Ukraine had enough equipment and initiative to capture Kharkiv and Kherson last year, but lacking enough firepower, training, and equipment to maintain its operational momentum, a lull descended across the front as both sides sat back to fortify and consolidate their fighting positions. Consequently, Russia had time to prepare what one commentator called the most defended frontier outside the DMZ in Korea. This year, Ukraine threatened to sever this frontier in two. By most measures, it has fallen short of its operational objectives. The road ahead is as uncertain as it has ever been. Western governments seem to have returned to square one, with policymakers on the fence about continued spending, institutional leaders clamoring for unity, and Ukraine in the middle of it all, wondering what the future holds. Underpinning all of this is the still credible stance that support for Ukraine represents an investment in global security. For all intents and purposes, Russia is gearing up its economy for the long haul. About 1/3 of the Russian budget has been directed for military spending. Putin has raised the maximum number of Russian army personnel to 2.2 million, with recruitment drives set to continue into the indefinite future. He is speaking of the aims of his ongoing special military operation in ever bolder terms. Ukrainian military leaders have articulated similar hopes to mobilize up to 500,000 men for the fight ahead, but President Zelensky has tempered their expectations, arguing that they need a comprehensive plan before approving such a costly move. And to have a plan, it needs assurances of comprehensive support. Whether it likes it or not, Ukraine's war must be planned in limbo, with one arm tied behind its back. Security investment maiming the Russian bear. There is an ongoing debate within the West to what extent material assistance constitutes a viable security investment. That is to say, if Western governments authorize billions in support for the year and years ahead, what will they get in return? There are two general stances on this issue. While some believes that the war can only have one true outcome, a return to Ukraine's original sovereign borders circa 1991, those who are more bearish on Ukraine believe a negotiated settlement is the only way forward. This outlook stems from a sense of Ukraine fatigue, said to be spreading throughout the West. Unless talks are entered into willingly by both sides, these individuals feel the slaughter will continue indefinitely with no end in sight. For the first group, support to Ukraine virtually pays for itself. The security benefits are undeniable. The only thing they are bearish about are the prospects of Russian victory. On the contrary, they are confident their provisions of assistance has not only diminished Russia's global prestige, but that it has demonstrably and systematically neutered the Russian military in such a way as to render it a non-threat for a generation to come. The outcome of the forthcoming American election will have direct implications on the degree to which the United States, and by consequence its European allies and partners, continue paying for their Ukraine security dividend. Republican presidential candidates are virtually split on the issue. Some, like Ron DeSantis, Vivek Ramaswamy, and of course Donald Trump, have expressed reluctance to extend US security guarantees into the future. Others, like Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, and Tom Scott, have said the opposite, some going as far as to claim the Biden administration has not done enough for Ukraine. Those in the first camp cite a familiar raft of reasons for their views. Historical instances of costly interventions like Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan loom large in the memory. What is the point of spending billions of dollars on a country over 4,500 miles away when there are ample domestic problems at home? Many claim, with reason, that Europe must be more proactive about its own security, and this includes shouldering the burden of financial assistance to their eastern neighbor. Others tout Ukraine's history of endemic political corruption, a vacuum from which they hope to protect the hard-earned cash of the American taxpayer. There are a few reasons why these criticisms fall short of the mark. The invasion of Ukraine may seem like a European problem. Most Europeans themselves admit to the feeling they, or their neighbors, could be doing more, and European think tanks and security experts are mostly united in their longer-term view that NATO's European members must collectively ramp up investment in ammunition production and focus their military training and force structures to credibly deter Russia from exploiting a clash between the US and China in the late 2020s as an opportunity to break Article 5 in Europe. In this scenario, they fear that if the United States becomes embroiled in a maritime conflict in the Pacific, their current dependence on US security guarantees and material assistance will leave them vulnerable to Russian aggression. NATO's ability to roll back Russian ground-based air defenses from the air, as well as ammunition resupply, tanker aircraft, command and control and satellite capabilities, are all heavily based on global American infrastructure. With Russia's supply situation steadily improving, Europeans are beginning to fear that they must improve their own production figures if they ever hope to stand on their own 2 feet. As it stands, Russia's reliance on North Korean and Iranian arms factories to supplement their own would still be enough to eclipse Europe's output of artillery shells and ammunition, with the notable exception of Poland. But even if Europe fails to sort out its defense priorities, Ukraine remains an issue of global concern. According to a CSIS report, the fact that the European Union is one of the United States' top 3 trading partners, and the United States is part of NATO alone, affords Ukraine support a top foreign policy priority. Saying that Ukraine is distracting the United States from domestic issues is akin to arguing that the United States would rather give up on global trade than deal with foreign politics. Foreign policy directly affects the well-being of Americans. Ultimately, the massive $113 billion of aid committed to Ukraine by the United States thus far has been a net positive for America's overall military preparedness. 40% of the almost $80 billion which has actually been sent to Ukraine was used directly on American war-related purposes. In other words, bolstering the US military. Sales for defense contractors increased by $15 billion from 2021 to 22. Companies have been able to test their equipment in real time, adapting their systems to the exigencies of the battlefield. Most defense contractors had never seen their systems perform in a peer conflict, that is to say against a peer adversary like Russia, with most having been road-tested and employed in counterinsurgency operations during the global war on terror. The corruption argument isn't completely off base, but on its own it fails to stand up to rigorous scrutiny. To say Ukraine is corrupt and thus undeserving of American aid would be to dismiss all the other advantageous economic and political partnerships Washington enjoys around the globe. In 2021, Mexico received 4 times the amount of direct foreign investment as Ukraine, despite ranking higher on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. Colombia, like Mexico, has consistently outdrawn Ukraine in foreign direct investment, despite its own sustained and rampant political corruption. The US Congress knew it would have to vet its nation's monetary disbursement to prevent high-handed corruption, and allocated $42 million and more than 90 professionals to the task, plenty to get the job done, according to one expert. This accountability structure could be easily amplified should the aid packages continue into 2024. This would be far preferable to abandoning the process altogether on rumors of corruption. For the record, the Department of Defense Officer of Inspector General has documented 0 instances of major fraud. This brings us back to the military and ethical implications of prolonged Western assistance. At no time since World War II has the United States military so clearly been afforded so much data, intelligence, and insight into the capacity of one of its peer threats, without having to expend its own military personnel in the process. In past conflicts, the United States and its NATO allies could only guess and project the impact of Russia's perceived military power, using passing encounters on distant battlefields like Syria and through second-hand observations in its operations in Georgia, Crimea, and Ukraine up through 2022. Now, terabytes of actionable intelligence are being processed from the front with every passing day. These are incorporated to refine and tailor existing command, control, logistics, and operational systems, which could have real-world implications if the United States is ever pulled into a conflict with NATO or a peer adversary elsewhere around the globe. Yes, there is a monetary price affixed to that benefit, but thus far, Ukraine has amply repaid the debt. Today, Russia occupies 14% of Ukrainian territory. At the height of its invasion, it held 27%. The conflict has strengthened the transatlantic alliance, reaffirming faith in its unique model of collective deterrence. It's also maimed the Russian bear. Citing some compelling figures, UK Defense Chief Tony Radakin commented in July that in 2022 alone, Russia lost nearly half the combat effectiveness of its army. It fired 10 million artillery shells, but at best can produce 1 million shells a year. It has lost 2,500 tanks, but at best can produce 200 tanks a year. It has sustained well over 300,000 battlefield casualties at a fraction of what the United States spends on its military every year. These are hard facts, irrespective of Ukraine's current operational prospects. Retaining the moral high ground. There are a few other reasons worth mentioning that highlight the relative fragility of the support skeptic camp. Among its many intangible benefits, the Ukraine security investment offers its proponents an undeniable slice of the moral high ground, an elusive outcome unfortunately lacking in many of the United States' previous military interventions. In the past, the United States has struggled to back its rhetorical evangelism for a free and open international order, engaging in covert regime change, war by proxy, or outright invasion to achieve its foreign policy ends, missions often inflected by ideological dogma. While it's true the US would regularly talk the talk, its intentions were betrayed in the way it walked the walk. Today, all Westerners have benefited in one way or another from fair and equal participation in the rules-based liberal international order. The foundational pillars of this order since its inception have been the democratic and moral values standing in stark contrast to the Putin-esque brand of authoritarianism which once ran rampant across the globe. Sustained support for Ukraine is one of history's clearest-cut cases of morally justifiable aid. With the risks of a general European war the highest they've been in decades, what has become clear in hindsight is that Western investment in Ukraine's security should have come sooner. Perhaps if the United States and its partners had offered more material assistance and political support in the aftermath of Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, the overall cost would be lower on all fronts: military, humanitarian aid, and economic stability. Russia has proven to be a one-trick pony hell-bent on aggression. If a negotiated settlement is the only way to end this war, neither side will agree to much in the near or long-term future. Russia will cling to every centimeter of territory with little regard for the men it sacrificed for Putin's aims. If aid to Ukraine is indeed suspended, many fear that territorial revisionists around the globe will feel emboldened to embark on similar ventures.